This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For the past few years, the situation in Syria has been relatively calm. Bashar al-Assad has reasserted control over most of the country, but a ceasefire negotiated by Turkey and Russia in 2020 has preserved a rebel holdout in the northwest, while a continued US military presence has shielded a de facto Kurdish state in the northeast. However, in part thanks to the instability in and around Israel, over the past few months, conflict has flared up again. And on Wednesday, anti-Assad rebels staged a shockingly successful offensive into the outskirts of Syria's second largest city, Aleppo. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this new rebel offensive, why it's all kicking off now, and what might come of it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a little bit of context. The Syrian Civil War started in 2011 with the Arab Spring, as Syrians across the country rose up against dictator Bashar al-Assad. Assad came to power in 2000, succeeding his father Hafez, who had himself ruled Syria since 1971. The protests quickly spiraled into a civil war, largely thanks to a predictably vicious response from Syrian security forces. The Syrian Civil War is still ongoing and is infamously complicated, but it can broadly be split into three phases. The first comes from about 2011 until about 2015, when, largely thanks to indirect support from a number of NATO states and Gulf monarchies, anti-Assad rebel forces made impressive gains, capturing the regional capitals of Raqqa in 2013 and Idlib in 2015. The second phase, which we might call the ISIS phase, slightly overlaps with the first phase, running from 2014 until about 2017. This is when basically everyone got together to push back ISIS, which capitalized on the political instability in Syria and neighboring Iraq to establish a caliphate, which, at its peak, covered roughly 100,000 square kilometers and 10 million people. By the end of 2017, however, ISIS were almost entirely defeated. To push back ISIS, the West, and especially the US, stepped up their support for the Kurds, a stateless ethnic group spread across southeast Turkey, northwestern Iran, northern Iraq, and northern Syria. Similarly, both to push back ISIS and to protect their ally, both Russia and Iran stepped up their support for Assad. This takes us on to the third phase, which runs from about 2016 until 2020. The Kurds established a relatively large autonomous zone in the north, thanks to American support, while Assad, with Russian and Iranian support, started recapturing territory from the rebels. In early 2020, it looked like the rebels, who were confined to just the northwest corner of Syria around Idlib, might be wiped out. But in March, Turkish President Recep Erdogan negotiated a ceasefire with Russian President Vladimir Putin. For context, Erdogan backs the rebels, both because he wants to use them to push back against the Kurds, for a fear that a de facto Kurdish state in northern Syria would both stoke separatist sentiment in Turkey and provide a base for Kurdish terrorist groups like the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and because he's never got on with Assad, for a variety of reasons. Anxieties about Kurdish separatism are what motivated Turkey's numerous incursions into northern Syria between 2016 and 2019, which created a sort of buffer zone along the Turkey-Syria border. Broadly speaking, the ceasefire held, leaving 4 de facto states within what used to be Syria: a Kurdish state in the rural northeast, a Turkish buffer state within that, a rebel stronghold in Idlib, and then the rest of the country, which is now controlled by Assad. This means that Assad now controls about 60% of Syria's territory, and the vast majority of its population. However, a couple of days ago, the violence restarted in earnest, when the main Islamist rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, launched an assault from its territory in Idlib towards government-held positions around Aleppo, a city that had once been a rebel bastion, but was recaptured by government forces in 2016 after a months-long siege. The offensive began on Wednesday, and the rebels made swift progress, seizing the Syrian Army's 46th Regiment's base and a handful of villages in the first 24 hours. On Thursday, they cut off the M5 highway at 2 points: the Aleppo suburb of Khan al-Assal and the town of Sarakib. For context, the M5 highway is basically the most important road in Syria, and it connects Aleppo to the capital Damascus. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, at least 200 people have been killed in the fighting so far. It's hard to know exactly how things are progressing, but as of Friday morning, it looks like the rebels had reached the western outskirts of Aleppo, which is pretty terrible news for Assad. So why has this happened now? In other words, why is a ceasefire that held for 4 years suddenly collapsed? Well, as we see it, there are two main reasons. First, what's happening in and around Israel. Israel's assault on Hezbollah in Lebanon meant that Iran and Hezbollah, who both back Assad, had to redirect their forces and attention to southern Lebanon. It's no coincidence that this assault started just a day after Netanyahu announced a new ceasefire in Lebanon. HTS will have wanted to attack before Hezbollah had time to redeploy its forces back to Syria. HTS will have also been helped by the recent Israeli airstrikes on Hezbollah and Iranian positions in Syria, which has weakened government forces. The second reason is the recent uptick in Syrian and Russian airstrikes against rebel positions. For context, over the past month or so, pro-Assad Syrian government forces have been striking rebel targets in Idlib, which many analysts suspected was a precursor to a new offensive against the rebels. Now, this might sound a bit weird, given what we've just said. After all, why would Assad and co try a new offensive when Hezbollah and Iran are preoccupied with Israel? And, well, it's hard to say, but it's probably in part because they thought that they could do it after the ceasefire in Lebanon, and because, until recently, it looked like Assad might be able to convince Turkey to wind down support for the rebels. The thinking here was that, given Assad's dominant position in Syria, Turkey might support Assad to both squeeze the Kurds and to make Syria politically stable enough that Erdogan could return at least some of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees currently living in Turkey. There were some tentative signs that things were moving in this direction. In July, for instance, Erdogan said he hoped to meet Assad for the first time in more than a decade. But the fact that this assault has gone ahead just 2 days after Erdogan had a call with Putin suggests that he is no longer so keen on mending ties with Assad. Anyway, this rebel assault would have been intended both to preempt any government offensive and to placate the locals in Idlib, who didn't like their homes were getting pounded by airstrikes. So, what happens next? Well, while many of our viewers might find it satisfying seeing the rebels deal a bloody nose to Assad, Putin and the Ayatollahs, the risk here is that this violence shatters Syria's fragile peace, which would be terrible news for ordinary Syrians, at least in the short term. As you've hopefully realised after an 8-minute video explaining the Syrian Civil War, you'll have noticed that here at TLDR News, we're committed to helping you learn. Fortunately, the sponsor of today's video shares this commitment and is one of the best websites on the internet to help you learn new skills from the ground up. That website is, you guessed it, Brilliant. Now, one of the best things about Brilliant is, rather than simply throwing information at you and testing you on it, Brilliant teaches you by doing. Each of their lessons is filled with hands-on activities in problem solving that helps you actually play with the concepts. This is proven to be 6 times more effective than simply watching lecture videos. And what's more, Brilliant actually helps you do all of this learning wherever you are. You can complete their lessons on your phone, so you can easily utilise any spare minutes you have in the day with actually worthwhile learning. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, so click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching the video, and thanks for Brilliant for supporting this video.